Imagine walking up to a hunter-gatherer from 30,000 years ago and handing him a $20 bill. Just plop it right in his hand. He'd look at it, he'd turn it over, he'd try to figure out what kind of magical leaves grow in your neighborhood. He might even give it a good sniff. But ultimately, he will have absolutely no idea what he is holding. And it's not because he's stupid. It's because the entire concept behind that piece of paper hasn't even been invented yet. The idea that a total stranger will trade you actual food, shelter, and safety for a green piece of paper with a dead president on it, purely because everyone else has collectively agreed to pretend it matters? Yeah, that concept doesn't exist. The story of how we got from absolutely nothing to this piece of paper controls whether you eat tonight is one of the strangest, most quietly insane stories our species has ever lived through. Because here is the big secret nobody tells you about money. It didn't start as currency. It started as memory. Long before things got digital, the ledger wasn't in a computer. It was entirely in our heads. See, for most of human history, there was no cash register in the cave. We've all seen the classic textbook example. A guy with 3 fish walks up to a guy with 2 axes, and they haggle until they make a trade. But that image, the pure barter economy, is actually one of the most persistent myths in economics, and anthropologists have been trying to kill it for decades. It turns out, economists basically just made it up to create a clean backstory for why money exists. Because when you actually go looking for a real historical society that ran on pure item-for-item barter, you basically can't find one. It completely vanishes. It doesn't show up in the archaeology. And it doesn't show up in the ethnography of living cultures either. It's a neat story we told ourselves, but it's mostly fiction. So if early humans weren't constantly swapping fish for axes with no strings attached, what were they actually doing? What actually happened is much stranger and, honestly, much more human. Small, early human groups didn't run on cold, calculated math. They ran on a system of mutual obligation. You gave your neighbor a share of the animal you killed today, not because you expected an axe in return tomorrow, but because you both knew, without writing it down anywhere, that he now owed you something. It wasn't a specific thing or a specific amount, just a general floating sense of debt that lived entirely within the relationship itself. Anthropologist David Graeber spent years documenting this exact pattern across dozens of early societies, and it is remarkably consistent. People kept track of who owed whom, sometimes for years, and sometimes for entire generations. Using nothing but memory, reputation, and social pressure, the ledger wasn't a physical book. The ledger was the community's shared brain. So, if you show our ancient hunter-gatherer a $20 bill, the closer translation isn't "here is wealth." It's "here is a promise made by nobody to nobody that absolutely everyone has agreed to honor anyway." That is what would blow his mind. Now, debt and obligation, that's old. That is probably as ancient as human groups themselves. As long as you are only dealing with the close family and friends in your immediate band, this informal memory system works perfectly. Because you know you're going to see that person again next week. Or next month, or next year. Personal memory is more than enough to keep the balance. But then, human populations grew, groups started to move, and we ran into a massive problem. Strangers. The moment humans started trading with people completely outside their immediate group, people they might never see again in their lives, that's the exact moment memory stopped being enough. You couldn't just rely on a shared brain anymore. To make trade work, you needed a physical, transferable object. Something a total stranger would accept right on the spot without needing to know you or trust you personally. And this is where history gets genuinely wild, because the objects different cultures use to solve this stranger problem are all over the map. Take the island of Yap in Micronesia. For centuries, the people there used enormous carved limestone discs as currency. They are called rye stones, and some of them can be up to 12 feet wide. Now, here is the part that breaks modern brains. The stones were often way too heavy to actually move. So when a transaction happened, two people would just agree that a specific stone now belonged to someone else. The stone never physically moved an inch. Everyone in the community simply remembered and honored that the ownership had moved. If that sounds familiar, it's because it should. That is exactly what a modern bank does when it updates a number in a digital database. While the actual gold bar sits entirely untouched in a high-security vault somewhere deep underground. The islanders of Yap basically figured out the core logic of modern digital banking using rocks the size of a car door, and they did it first. Turns out, our advanced economic systems aren't so new after all. Other parts of the world looked at entirely different objects to solve the trade problem. Cattle worked as currency across huge patches of ancient Africa and Eurasia. In fact, the Latin word for money, pecunia, comes directly from pecus, meaning cattle. In the Roman world, salt was so incredibly valuable that soldiers were often partially paid directly in it. And yes, that is genuinely where we get the modern word salary. Meanwhile, tiny cowrie shells traveled along trade networks from the Indian Ocean straight into mainland Africa and China for thousands of years. They were so widely used that in ancient China, the literal written character for money was built directly out of the symbol for a shell. But notice something weird? You can't actually eat a shell to survive. And you definitely can't build a warm house out of salt blocks. Their value existed entirely because a whole community agreed it existed, and they kept agreeing, trade after trade. Money isn't a concrete object. Money is a group of people all deciding to believe the exact same fiction at the exact same time. Actual standardized metal money, coins, finally burst onto the scene around 600 BC in the kingdom of Lydia, in what is now Western Turkey. They took small lumps of electrum, a natural gold and silver alloy, and smacked them with a heavy official iron stamp. This stamp officially guaranteed the exact weight and purity of the metal. And this was a genuinely massive leap forward for humanity. Because for the first time ever, the value of the trade didn't depend on trusting the specific person who was handing you the metal. It depended entirely on trusting the stamp. The state had officially inserted itself right into the middle of the handshake. You didn't need to know if the merchant was a good guy. You just needed to trust the king. Transactions became faster, colder, and completely standardized. As long as the king's power was secure, the economy thrived. With state-backed trust established, the concept of money was ready to spread globally. From Lydia, things move incredibly fast. Coinage spreads rapidly through Greece, through Persia, and all over the massive Roman Empire. But carrying thousands of metal coins to make large purchases was exhausting and highly impractical. Plus, pulling a massive cart full of shiny metal over a dark mountain pass full of desperate bandits? Not a great idea. To solve this, paper money officially shows up in China under the Tang and Song dynasties. Merchants absolutely loved it because carrying a light piece of paper note was incredibly easy compared to heavy coins. At first, these slips were just promises of real physical metal being held somewhere safe. But notice the trend. Every single innovation in the entire history of money is exactly the same trick. It's just wearing a slightly different costume every few hundred years. You just take something that people already trust, And you find a lighter, more portable, more abstract stand-in for it that they will trust just as much. And that trend never stopped. It just kept climbing further and further away from anything physical. We went from coins backed by metal, to paper backed by coins, to paper backed by absolutely nothing but a government promise. And now, we have numbers on a screen representing an idea of value that no human has physically touched in years. Our ancient hunter-gatherer would have figured out a cowrie shell in about 5 minutes. He would need considerably longer with a banking app. But here is the moral turn in the story. The more abstract and portable money became, the easier it got to strip the relationship out entirely. A stamped coin doesn't need you to know the person who mined the silver. A number on a screen definitely doesn't care. Somewhere in that long march from shared tribal obligation to anonymous currency, we traded something real for something efficient. We gained a hyper-fast global system that lets total strangers on opposite sides of the planet do business in seconds. But we lost the exact thing that used to make an economic exchange a deeply human one. Efficiency won, but the connection vanished. So what would our ancient human actually think of money if you sat him down and explained the whole arc of it? Honestly, he'd recognize the concept of debt right away. Owing people things and being owed things is just how human groups have always worked. He might even totally get the shells and the stones because he understands the mental trick of agreeing a useless object is worth something. But the part that would genuinely stop him, the part that might actually frighten him a little, is how far we let the fiction travel away from the actual people involved. He built his trust out of physical faces he recognized around a warm fire. We built ours out of cold numbers on a screen, backed by a promise, backed by another promise. Yet, if you keep pulling that thread far enough back through history, you eventually find exactly what he started with. Just regular people agreeing to trust each other so that life could keep moving forward. Because that's really all money has ever been. Not gold, not paper, not the digit balance on your banking app right now. Just trust, wearing a different disguise. Next time you tap your card, you aren't looking at physical wealth. You're looking at a social promise so old, we forgot it was ever a promise at all.